Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly webinar. My name's Chris and I'm on the engagement team here at Planet Tracker. Over the next 30 minutes or so, my colleagues Richard and Thalia will discuss our latest work on plastic additives and microplastics. Some quick housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions, please add them in the Q&A. We'll try and pick them up there, but in case we don't get back to you on the webinar, we'll reply via email later on. And lastly, we will be recording this webinar and sharing afterwards. Before we kick it off, I just want to take a minute or so to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. We focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We produce in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on the slide here. We're not for profit, so everything we do is for the common good, and all of our research is publicly available on our website or on your usual financial data platforms. And with that being said, we will dive into the webinar. The first piece of research we want to discuss is our report on additives that was actually released today. So with me is my colleague Richard, who leads our work on this topic. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am going to discuss the research report that, as Chris mentioned, we published today, which is focused on plastic additives and how their potential toxicity could be a risk for corporates and their investors. So, just to set the scene, plastic additives range from chemicals used to colour the plastic to those providing enhanced functionality, such as things like flame retardants. So when you are using a product made of plastic, it almost certainly also contains a plastic additive of some sort, potentially more than one type. Now, these additives can potentially be released from plastic along its entire life cycle, when the plastic is being made or shaped, when the final product is being used by you or me, when waste is recycled, discarded, or breaks down in the environment. And it's actually very important to note that poorly managed plastic waste is a particularly important route for these chemicals to enter the air, the water, and soils. Now, once these chemicals are released from the plastic, they can pose a threat to human and environmental health. So this makes plastic additives a potential litigation risk in the future. Recent cases which spring to mind where chemicals have really come back to haunt their manufacturers include Bayer's ongoing woes around glyphosate. The life science companies have paid out around litigation costs of around 13 billion euros in the last 5 years, and the legal cases are continuing. Alternatively, litigation related to PFAS pollution has cost 3M $10.3 billion in the US, and the company continues to face challenges related to PFAS contamination in various jurisdictions, including Europe. So this producing dangerous toxic chemicals and putting them out into the environment or where they harm people can be a real important cause of litigation expense. So the potential negative impact of plastic and plastic-related chemicals is an area of increasing focus for academic research, with a notable increase in published papers in the last 10 years in particular. It's also something which is starting to enter the wider consciousness of consumers as they think about what is in their food, what is in their water supply, and how they may be exposed to toxins as they go about their daily lives. Now, this increasing focus on potential harms and generation of new data on toxic impacts means we may be on the cusp of significant new litigation, remediation costs and enforcement, and reputational risks for corporates that are producing and releasing these chemicals. So, our new report we're publishing today looks at the plastic additives available via an industry sales portal and then tries to examine their known toxicity and looks at the lack of transparency around what's actually in these additives. We examined over 18,000 plastic additives from 100 suppliers. We then used a large language model to map the additives to their chemical constituents, particularly to a CAS number, which is a Chemical Abstract Service Registry number. Now, that sounds slightly nerdy, perhaps a little bit technical, but basically that's a unique identifier that every different chemical in the world has a different CAS number. So it allows us to get beyond a name, beyond a brand name, to actually understand what are the chemicals inside or being put into a particular additive. Using the CAS number then allows us to look for chemical hazard information for that specific chemical. That is data indicating if the chemical has been found to be toxic to either the environment more broadly or humans specifically. Now, the startling issue was that for 45% of the additives that we analysed, we could not identify the chemicals in constituents at all. 45% could find absolutely no evidence of what was in them. We therefore could not make any assessment of their toxicity or determine if they've ever been subject to scientific testing. For 11% of the additives we examined, we could identify the constituent chemicals, but there's been no testing as far as we can find to indicate if they're toxic in any way. So for a massive 56% of those 18,000 additives examined, we could not determine anything about their potential toxicity. They are a complete black box in terms of their potential harms. Now, where we could identify the chemical constituents, some 25% of the additives we examined were rated as chemicals of high concern using a standardized data set owned by ChemForward. These are chemicals for which it should be a priority to look for alternatives which represent less of a risk to health. Now, after a number of statistics which are pretty bad news, the one highlight was of those chemicals we could identify the constituents, 50% were rated as low concern. We see this as positive evidence that safer chemistry is possible in many cases, and it'd be particularly interesting in further analysis in the future to look at these safer options and compare where they're being used at the same time as more dangerous ones, and I wonder why are some companies still choosing to use the more toxic option. So what are our recommendations? Now, our analysis underlines the significant data gaps on many chemicals. In our view, investors should worry about potential future litigation or remediation costs for these chemicals. And we make two key recommendations for investors in light of this. First, push for more transparency. This means investors should engage with investee companies so that they market products with clear chemical identifier information. That's put out those CAS numbers, tell us what is in these products. They should push for corporates to release safety data if they have it on their products. Now, as I mentioned, for a lot of these, we couldn't find the safety data. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's not in the public domain. And where data isn't available, corporates should be encouraged to run or fund chemical hazard assessments and commit to releasing the findings. Our second recommendation is push corporates towards safer chemistry. Now, there are tools out there such as ChemForward's plastic additives optimization tool, which can help identify available alternatives that have the same functionality but have been shown to be less toxic. Corporates should also invest in innovation towards safer chemicals, where alternatives are not currently available or where their use is not currently economically viable. And overall, we recommend including the toxicity of product portfolios into assessments of any potential chemical sector investment and making them a focus for engagement with management of these companies. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Richard. And a question for you. How much would it cost to do the chemical hazard assessments you mentioned, and what about the commercial sensitivity of the products?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. No, I think it's fair to say that until recently, assessing the hazard of a product portfolio could have been costly, and given the number of chemicals involved, yielded a relatively low information return on the investment. Now, there are proven models for how to systematically and cost-effectively inventory and assess chemicals in product sectors, with costs as low as around $5,000 per tested chemicals being reported today, and that price is constantly falling. And in our view, that investment should be seen as an offset to the potential future cost of litigation or remediation. I'd also note that many companies would be using the same chemicals, so there is some element of cost sharing potentially possible as well. As for your question around commercial sensitivity, completely understand. Companies want to keep, some proprietary knowledge, IP about what exactly they're putting into their products, but we'd favour publishing data around what are the chemicals involved, not necessarily the mixture. A bit like, Coca-Cola. You don't know exactly what they put in their Coca-Cola secret sauce, but we at least know that it's not toxic. We can probably manage the same thing for chemical additives.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. Next, I'm going to turn to Thalia to provide an update on our microplastics work. Thalia, over to you. Thalia, I think you're on mute. Sorry, thanks.
Well, didn't start very well. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. What I was saying that you didn't hear was that I would like to present our recent publication on microplastics, a report that we actually developed in collaboration with MSCI Sustainability Institute, and in which we examined the macro risks and the cost of inaction on this critical issue. This research comes at a very pivotal moment. While global negotiations on the Global Plastic Treaty continue to face challenges, the risks for companies and investors are accelerating regardless of international policy outcomes. Regional regulations are tightening, litigation is mounting, and scientific evidence of health impacts is becoming increasingly conclusive. Today, I will walk you through 4 key areas. First, the issue itself and why it matters. Second, our main findings from the research. Third, what this means for different sectors. And finally, our recommendations for how investors can respond. Let's begin with the main issue we are addressing. Yes. So first, microplastics are now everywhere. They are found in soil, water, the food we eat, and even the air that we breathe. Once they enter the environment, they are nearly impossible to remove. Second, the health implications are alarming. Scientific studies increasingly link microplastics to hormone disruption, heart diseases, and various chronic illnesses. The global economic burden from these health impacts is estimated at 1.5 trillion annually. Third, companies are facing mounting risk. We are seeing a surge in legal action, tightening regulations, and significant reputational damage. Litigation costs in the sector are projected to exceed $20 billion US by 2030, with possible maximum liabilities potentially exceeding even 100 billion. While these figures may represent a small fraction of total sector profits, extreme cases could have material financial impacts. There are indirect effects such as credit rating downgrades, higher insurance premiums, and share price volatility. And I will give you an example. PepsiCo is facing a lawsuit from Los Angeles County for allegedly misleading consumers about the recyclability of its plastic packaging and downplayed environmental harms. The county now seeks for civil penalties, payment for cleanup costs, and a ban against deceptive marketing. If successful, the case could result in substantial financial liabilities, reputational damage, and stricter regulatory obligations for the company's practices. Finally, there is a critical governance gap. A staggering 88% of companies lack, in our dataset, comprehensive strategies to address environmental impact of packaging and therefore to mitigate microplastic pollution. This leaves them dangerously exposed to the risks that I have outlined. So the issue is clear. Microplastics pose significant environmental, health, and financial risks, and most companies are unfortunately unprepared. So our research reveals 3 critical findings. First, poor plastic waste governance is financially material. A 12-year analysis finds that companies with poor plastic risk management show 2 times higher likelihood of experiencing 50 to 70% share price drawdowns compared to strong performers. Companies with better governance also allow lower volatility in revenue and cash flow. While we don't comment on the absolute likelihood of any individual company suffering a large drawdown, this relative difference is substantial and demonstrates a clear association between plastic strategy and financial stability. Second, there is a significant accountability gap. More than half of companies in the packaged food sector, 55%, have set no packaging-related targets whatsoever. In restaurants, that figure jumps to 72%. And even among those with some commitments, very few have developed comprehensive company-wide strategies to address the issue. Third, when commitments do exist, They are often too narrow to be credible. Many targets apply only to specific product lines or geographic markets rather than across full operations. This selective approach not only limits effectiveness, but also exposes companies to accusations of greenwashing and potential regulatory non-compliance. So these findings paint a clear picture. The corporate response to microplastic remains inadequate across most sectors. Now, to conclude, based on our findings, we recommend 3 key actions for investors. First, to conduct a comprehensive portfolio review, identify which holdings have significant exposure to microplastic pollution, particularly in consumer-facing sectors like food, beverages, and personal care, and then incorporate these packaging waste risks into the ESG assessments and investment decisions. Second, actively engage with portfolio companies. Push them to establish science-based company-wide packaging goals, not just selective commitments. This means demanding measurable targets for recycled content, concrete plans for circular economy strategies, and transparent reporting on progress. Finally, systematically integrate microplastic risk into the ESG decision-making framework. This includes evaluating how packaging materials break down into microplastics over time and factoring this pollution risk into the investment assessments. Companies that fail to address these risks should be weighted accordingly in the portfolio decisions. By taking these steps, investors can both mitigate microplastic-related risks and support the transition to a more sustainable circular economy. And that's from me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Thalia. And a quick question for you. Do you think that microplastics could become a systemic risk indicator and the next test of how markets integrate environmental health data into financial models?
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Chris. I do, actually. I do think that microplastics could become a systemic risk indicator and perhaps the next significant challenge for how these companies factor environmental health data into the modeling. In many ways, microplastics are where carbon emissions were, 15 years ago. The science is becoming clearer. We now have strong evidence linking microplastics to health issues like heart disease and hormone disruption and so on. And financial institutions are starting to pay attention. So we are seeing insurers, asset managers begin to assess how these risks flow through their portfolios. Now the challenge is that regulation is not keeping up. So take EU, for instance. EU is ahead most regions, and yet, even there, only intentionally added microplastics, like those in cosmetics, are restricted. The vast majority, from packaging, clothing, tires, still slip through the cracks. So, while the science is advancing, a lot of risks remain completely unaddressed. This gap means that investors are exposed to growing risks that aren't yet priced in. Until regulation catches up, it's really on investors to do their own due diligence through research, scenario planning, and active engagement in order to understand where these risks might arise. Otherwise, markets could easily be caught off guard when the health and policy impacts of microplastics started to materialize more rapidly. So I would say, in order to manage that stress test properly, we need stronger foundation. Companies to disclose standardized data on their plastic use and pollution, clearer integration of these risks into credit ratings and financial models, and most importantly, credible policy signals, so the compliance costs aren't guesswork. And if we get these things right, then markets will be able to get ahead of the problem rather than scrambling to react after the fact. And it's really about being proactive instead of reactive and applying the lessons that we have already learned from carbon and climate to the plastic issue.
That's great. Thank you very much, Thalia. And just before we wrap up the webinar, I just wanted to mention some of the other reports and research that Plant Tracker have been doing. So early this month, we released our updated climate transition assessment of BASF, assessing the credibility of their climate transition plans. We've also released similar updates on Bayer, Incitec, and Toray Industries earlier this year, so please do check them out. BASF is the most recent one of those in the series. And over the next week or so, we expect to release the first report from our methane series that is looking at the methane emissions targets and strategies of the 52 biggest meat, dairy, and rice companies. So look out for that one as well. And I appreciate this was quite a quick webinar, but that does bring us to the end. As mentioned earlier, if we've not got around to answering a question, we'll follow up later. Please feel free to hang around and drop your questions if you have any in the Q&A box, and then I'll close the webinar in a couple of minutes or so. But thank you for joining us, and we hope you found it useful. Goodbye.